about to tell you is the truth. These photographs are of my family. Pictured here are Basil the Butcher and his wife, Peacock Pearl Byrne, two of Manchester's most notorious kingpins of 19th century criminality. Abandoned during his childhood, Basil made his way through life begging, stealing, and for the most part, bullying his way into money and food. However, his methods were sloppy, and it was only until his chance meeting with Pearl Cartwright that their steady climb up the criminal ladder began. Whereas Basil was a brutal and unforgiving thug, Pearl had the cunning and vulpine slyness that was needed to master the undisciplined hoodlum. At 15, the pair began a passionate romance, as well as an unstoppable criminal takeover, uniting urchin gangs across Manchester through coercion, bribery, and force. It wasn't long into their fledgling career that older, more organised groups took the pair under their wing, teaching them the tricks of the trade, until at 21, Peacock and Butcher took their rightful place as king and queen of crime. Practically untouchable, Pearl and Basil lived a life of relative luxury, paid for by brothels and opium dens all across the city. However, their rise to power did not go unnoticed, and the constabulary pulled all available resources to arrest the duo. This photograph was taken on Pearl's 30th birthday, shortly before the two were arrested. Despite their infamy, little evidence ever made it to court, and national papers began to turn the story into a mini-serial with predictions as to what the two had planned as an escape, or who they had bribed before the trial began. Despite this, the court did eventually find Basil and Pearl guilty. 2 weeks after the trial, they were hung in Strangeways Prison. The prison's occupants, apparently, stayed deadly silent before and after the executions took place. A sign of respect toward their late king and queen. Edgar Byrne was the third of 4 sons born in the autumn of 1873. Dropped at birth, the family considered Edgar to be slow, but marvelled when, in his 20th year, he became pastor of the local church. Contrary to the family's predictions, Edgar went from strength to strength, building a vast following of worshippers also inflicted with slowness of mind and other disabilities. So large was this congregation of outcasts that people would flock to the church to see the spectacle of freaks as they prayed. At 24, Edgar began to preach politics to his flock, declaring that the last days were too far away for the meek to wait for earthly inheritance. 2 weeks after this initial polemic, and with his popularity growing, Edgar was found dead, slumped in the corner of his bedroom. The cause of his death remains unknown. Alice Byrne was a well-respected member of the small village of Ray Green. Being both philanthropic and kind-hearted, the village's principal citizens understood that in return for her altruism, her privacy was to be respected. And yet it is reported that shortly after Boxing Day in 1890, Alice's groundskeeper approached the local priest, confessing to having married her, despite Alice already having 5 husbands. Although at first this was dismissed as a vulgar attempt to discredit the good lady, After her roofer reported being Alice's second husband, the local community's suspicions became riled. Trapped by the judgment of the mob, Alice declared defiantly that she had in fact 6 husbands, each of whom was a member of her household staff. Though she was brought up Catholic, Alice found the revolutionary teachings of Joseph Smith to be a spiritual awakening, and isolation from the religious cult proper allowed Alice to deviate from the doctrine towards a matriarchal purpose. In her diary, Alice often wrote about her inability to conceive with each new husband and the jealous feuds that broke out between them. Shortly after the revelation, Alice sold her property and moved to Utah. The twins, Chloe and Isabel, lived in a workhouse district of Clitheroe and took employment in one of the cotton mills when they reached the age of 13. From early in their childhood, it is recorded that neither could tolerate one another's presence, and they would often quarrel over the pettiest of things. Far from the usual empathic link twins are often said to share, their hatred was so embittered that even in the workhouse, their separation was mandatory. Late into their 18th year, it is reported that Isabel was found breaking into the workhouse, tampering with equipment with the intent to do harm to others. Her trial would have been swift if it were not for her sister's protestations, claiming that she was in fact Isabel and Chloe had stolen her name, passing herself off as Isabel upon being caught. The court, unconcerned with which sister was which, sentenced who they thought to be Isabel to 10 years' imprisonment. Throughout the rest of her life, the sister declared to be Chloe, protested to be Isabel, and at one time was committed to an insane asylum for her indignation. She became reserved and withdrawn after her stay at the asylum, and Chloe would only ever show emotion again when news of her sister's death from consumption reached her. On her own deathbed, Chloe declined her last rites unless it was accepted that she was in fact Isabel. The priest refused. This picture was taken a year before the aforementioned events. Which twin is which is uncertain. Nanny Myrtle was considered a spiritual healer and apothecary in Todmorden, Lancashire, where it is reported that people often visited her in search of relief for all manner of ailments. Her Book of Shadows revealed that most of her spells and potions involved ground mice bones and a considerable amount of liquor. Despite this, Myrtle's popularity as a healer never diminished, and even as an elderly woman, she still made concoctions for ailing visitors, swearing by them herself as the reason for her longevity. She died, aged 101 years old. Elmer is still considered an artist in some circles even today, having a raw talent for taxidermy, a trade taught to him by his father. Respected for making the animals look extremely realistic, many a game hunter came to him for his unique skill. It is through his taxidermy workshop that he met and fell in love with his wife, Ethel. For many years, Elmer and Ethel were inseparable, with Ethel finding herself a place in the workshop so that even at his workplace, the two could stay together. It was a matter of great curiosity then, that in their later years, Ethel stopped attending social events and functions altogether. Elmer would always make excuses for her, claiming that she was ill and thus unable to attend church, dinners, or the like. Even at the taxidermy workshop, Ethel had seemed to recoil into herself, sitting away from the main room while avoiding all attempts at conversation from customers and friends. It was only on the death of Elmer himself that the morbid truth was discovered. Upon approaching Ethel to inform her of her husband's death, a police constable found it impossible to contain his horror. The dear lady had in fact been tanned and stuffed some years earlier. Fearful of a moral panic, the local police hushed up the incident, informing the papers that Ethel had died of grief shortly after Elmer. A diary entry of Elmer's talks plainly and emotionally of how, despite Ethel's death, he could not bear to lose her, hoping that by preserving Ethel, he could at least still look on her face until the day he rejoined her in spirit. This is a photograph of the Right Honourable Bartholomew Byrne. Bartholomew was an infamous member of Parliament who lobbied against anti-slavery legislation. This picture was taken on the day of his wedding. His wife, Catalina, is also pictured. The marriage did not last. Playboy, adventurer, spy. Willie Byrne wrote of his time as an international British agent with some pride in his memoirs. Being adept at most sports, a fencing champion, and fluent in 8 languages made Willie a perfect candidate in becoming a competent spy for Her Majesty. According to the notes and maps hidden in Willie's memoirs, most operations occurred deep within the Ottoman Empire, but he also told anecdotes of his travels in Siberia, Prussia, and Africa. Also interesting are Willie's extensive notes on his global harem of lovers, both male and female, who seemed bewitched by the enigmatic Englishman and his overflowing charisma. Sadly, contention rests round Willie's tall tales, as all official records state him to be a bricklayer from Eccles. What is known to be true is that Willie Byrne lost his life to syphilis. His last diary entry reads, "Being sent to Tunisia, do not favour my chances on this mission." So convinced of the hot air balloon's prowess as a means of travel, Rupert Byrne poured his savings into creating a company that would see hot air balloons transport customers from Manchester to London in ease and comfort. Though many were sceptical, Rupert nonetheless laboured on, finally completing his company's balloon pavilion on the outskirts of Trafford. To prove the safety of the device as a means of travel, and to finally silence the naysayers once and for all, Rupert invited his wife and all 8 of his children to sail on the maiden voyage of the flagship balloon Icarus that would leave Trafford and arrive in London some hours later. 50 minutes into the flight, Icarus crashed into a farmhouse in Cheshire, killing all on board. Devastated, Rupert quickly lost impetus towards the hot air balloon industry, his company crumbling within 6 months. It is unknown what happened to Rupert after the death of his family, or indeed after the collapse of his business, though legend tells of him taking his last remaining balloon into the heavens, never to be seen again. Aurora Byrne was a very pious woman, and from an early age she compensated for her poverty through her love of the church. It was through her devotion to our Lord and Saviour that Aurora managed to find work as an organ player for her local Rochdale parish. Despite the enjoyment the job brought her, it left her little in way of financial recompense, and so through the offer of a friend, Aurora also gained work as an assistant to the town photographer. Aurora's work at the photography studio began well enough. She seemed to pick up the skills of the trade quickly and efficiently. It was on an evening set aside for her to learn more about the photographic technique that Aurora found herself sharing a glass of port with the debonair photographer, growing fond of this man who had provided her with this exciting and rewarding profession. It was only in the morning that Aurora realized the haziness of her recollection of the previous night. Some weeks later, the nature of that night became apparent. After Sunday service, Aurora was summoned to see the vicar who, upon her arrival, confronted her with prints of herself naked and in lewd, suggestive positions. Mortified, Aurora declared that she had not known about the pictures and that she had been gravely taken advantage of. A public outcry ensued, and the photographer was caught and arrested for his heinous indecency. Sadly for Aurora, the damage had already been done. Rumour spread of the photographs, and it was not long before people sought them out, be it for reviled curiosity or perverted pleasure. The result of this demand made Aurora an outsider in her own community, harlot to some, fool to others. The biggest blow came when she was politely asked to leave the church, losing her only means of escape from her mental torment. Workless and ostracised, Aurora's body was found by the bank of the River Roach. The photograph taken here was taken by the perpetrating photographer. My family tried to hide these stories, to bury them from view forever. Yet without our heritage, how can we truly understand ourselves or our place in this world? Upon his deathbed, my grandfather related these stories so that I could, in return, relate them to you, ensuring that our family history would not fall foul of rumour or obscurity. It is with this in mind that I remind you that everything I have said is completely true.